So I'm going to get started with the session. But good evening, everyone. Welcome to the National MAPS Committee Demystifying Disabilities in Medicine webinar series. My name is Grace Akpali, and I'll be the moderator for today's session. As the current Region 2 MAPS liaison and a National Future Leadership Fellow for the National MAPS Committee, I'm honored to guide our discussion this evening. This series aims to shed light on the challenges faced by medical trainees with disabilities or chronic illnesses as they navigate their medical training. Over 2 parts, we seek to not only raise awareness, but to also showcase the journeys and resources of the selected panelists, which will include medical students, residents, and physician attendings. Tonight, we'll hear from 4 medical school panelists at various stages of their medical school curriculum. They will also address critical questions and share resources that have proven successful in their medical training and residency applications. On March 12th, for part 2, we'll host a Q&A panel featuring current residents and attendings. Without further ado, I would like to have our panelists share their names, academic backgrounds, and introduce themselves to our live audience before we start the session. DJ, if you wouldn't mind starting us off with introductions.
Hi, everybody. My name is DJ Zwaga. I'm a second-year medical student at University of Wisconsin. I grew up in Madison and spent some time in Texas after graduation before I moved back. I want to say a lot of my pre-med journey, I actually attribute more to just being like a health journey. So just really learning more about how to just feel better. I didn't realize really that I was living with a lot of chronic illness. And so a lot of like discovering how to manage and just cope with that, I think really led to a lot of my pre-med experiences that ultimately got me into medical school. So when I came in very just proactive about how to continue to advocate for myself, but also just became very passionate about how to help other people advocate for themselves because I just know how challenging it can be. So that's kind of why I'm here tonight, to really see how I can be helpful, maybe just share my journey, and even the ongoing journey of how this has been unfolding while I'm in medical school. So I appreciate everybody's time.
Hi, everyone.
We're just doing introductions, but if you don't mind, if you're ready to introduce yourself, Dahlia, you can just share a little bit about your academic background, your journey thus far, and why you were interested in being a panelist for this session.
Hi, everyone. I'm studying on spring break in California right now, so I apologize. I'm just in a random coffee shop, so I apologize for the loudness. But I am originally from Northern California in Chico. I went to undergrad at Chico State, and I have a degree in molecular biology. I took some time off, had a couple of big job jobs, and then I got into med school, moved to Chicago, and I was diagnosed with a couple of like I have a gynecological issue and also a couple undiagnosed invisible disabilities. So that's all that I found out in medical school. So that's why I'm here, and thank you, Grace, for putting this on.
Thank you so much for volunteering your time to be a panelist. And then Malakia Hines, if you don't mind introducing yourself next.
Hi, my name is Malakia. I am a second-year medical student at Harvard Medical School. I'm originally from Trinidad and Tobago, lovely Twin Islands, in the Caribbean. Born and raised there, and I moved to the United States in 2016 for college at UNC Chapel Hill. Graduated in NIH for a while, and now I'm in medical school. My journey has been, I guess, I was born with a disability. I was born with one hand. So in terms of my journey into medicine, a lot of my desire to pursue medicine stemmed from having, my experience with one hand and navigating health disparities regarding that, and wanting to chart the course in terms of advocating for my patients in the future. I would say, in addition to wanting to be on this panel today, I would say it's to share my experience and what it's been like being, I guess, the first student at Harvard to ever have, one hand, and also, the first person I'd ever seen as a future physician who has been, representing with my personal disabilities, and like what that experience has been like navigating, getting accommodations, navigating, my own intersecting other identities, and also, sharing how, what that looks like, I guess, in terms of my life experience leading me here. So anything that could be helpful, I hope I can share that too.
And then Stephanie, if you can introduce yourself as well.
Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining in. I'm very honored to be here. I am a fourth-year medical student in Chicago, and I'm originally from Colorado. I went to the University of Colorado in Boulder, and I took a couple years off between college and medical school, where I continued to work, take the MCAT again. I also got married during that time, and I worked as a case manager for children with disabilities. So I think honestly, that is kind of the first introduction really to the disability world. I had really grown up struggling with academics, but did not have the resources or knowledge to get tested or get the healthcare resources that I needed until I got to medical school. And it wasn't until my second year of medical school that the courses that we were doing were actually directly linked to the symptoms that I had been just living with a lot of, and I thought were normal, but they really weren't normal. And going later, got diagnosed with different invisible disabilities, and through my experience that I'm sure we'll talk about later, different challenges of step exams and accommodations and clinicals, I am finally a fourth year medical student. I submitted my match data. It's due at 8 p.m. tonight in an hour. So I am here now just waiting for the next 2 weeks.
That is great. I think you guys have like such incredible journeys, and just like hearing your journey, a little bit about your journey in med school and some of the things that you've overcome and the records that you've broken at like your respective institutions. Very much excited for you in the match process. I'm like, it's almost over. But yeah, so just to get started, I had a few prepared questions and plans to transition. Our audience, if you feel comfortable submitting questions in the chat, we'll kind of go back and forth between some of the pre-prepared questions and some of the questions that will come in from the audience. We may not have enough time to answer all of the audience questions, but we'll try our best to incorporate that into the programming for tonight. So one of the questions that I had kind of to pose to some of the students within your pre-clerkship curriculum, what are some of the specific challenges, or is there any specific challenges that you faced during the pre-clerkship phase, and how did you address them?
I can start. So I just finished my pre-clerkship phase actually as of December. So a lot of my pre-clerkship phase was actually still trying to figure out some of my diagnoses. So I think that's what's made it really challenging, is because in higher education, a lot of times, like, you need a specific diagnosis, and then you need to know like what are your limitations to request accommodation from the school, in terms of like some of my like physical health symptoms. And so I had been living for like the last 15 years of my life with a pretty severe hypersomnia that had been getting worse, and then I also was having like joint pain that had been getting worse, and especially like in my hands. And um like during exams, like I would be so afraid of falling asleep in the middle of exams that I was like kind of rushing through my tests to finish. And like I couldn't really I was having a hard time staying awake in lectures. And then like just those some of the hands-on responsibilities, like clinical skills and like being in preceptor all day, like some of that by the end of the day, like my joint pain was just so bad. And so I really had to advocate with the school to get some reasonable accommodations while I was pursuing some diagnoses. And it like unfortunately took most of my pre-clerkship years. But like at the tail end, I finally started to get like testing. So like I had a rheumatology evaluation coming up because I like had some rheumatoid arthritis labs come back positive, and like I'm working with sleep clinic right now to like pursue some of the hypersomnia. But I think it's really difficult when you don't have a diagnosis, but you know that you're living with some pretty debilitating, especially chronic pain. And when you're high functioning, it's really easy to dismiss. There's a term that I recently learned about from our Disability Resource Center called masking, where you just kind of learn to cope and perform at the same level of your peers around you because like you live so long with your symptoms that you kind of have to find a way to cope. And so I think a lot of my asks for help were always dismissed, where people would tell me like, well, you look fine or you seem like you're doing fine. And that made it difficult too, because I'm like saying I'm really struggling, I'm in pain, I'm really having a hard time. People kind of dismissed it like, well, you're doing better than me, so it can't be that bad. And so some of it was like peer-to-peer challenges, but also some of it was really getting administration to work with me on some accommodations so that I could get the time and space that I needed to like be set up for success, but also like pursue a diagnosis.
Thank you so much for sharing all of that. It's like I saw a lot of nods from other panelists just in agreement with some of those challenges and bringing up the term masking, because I think for this specific population, that is like very, very common from a lot of people's narratives. So thank you so much for sharing that. And I want to open it up if anyone wants to answer that question.
Yeah, sure. Thank you, Dija. I was the one that was very much nodding, because I very much agree with that and feel those sentiments. Living with chronic pain myself and having chronic pain condition, I feel you, and I feel the struggle going through, because that's when I similarly went through a lot of my challenges of months of diagnosis while trying to balance doing well in school. And that was actually part of the reason that I had to take a leave of absence from medical school between my second and third year of medical school, because my health conditions and trying to get diagnosed was just taking so much of my mental energy that I wasn't able to just focus on my academics at that time. It was step one exam. And through taking a leave of absence and going and trying to study for step one, I also ended up failing step one. And at that point, I didn't know that I could even use accommodations, because in my mindset, I thought that accommodations were just for learning disabilities. And since I didn't have a diagnosis, like you said, of learning disabilities, I had never received anything before, but had still struggled. And it wasn't until I failed the step one exam that one of my friends who I had disclosed to had mentioned, like, hey, have you heard of the accommodations office? Did you know that health conditions are a disability and you might require? And that was the biggest thing, was just learning that there was supports out there for something that I hadn't had the opportunity to receive. And once I actually used the accommodations and was able to find something that worked for my body, then I was able to pass step one and continue on with my clerkship years. But I definitely associate a lot of imposter syndrome during my pre-clerkship years, of just not understanding why I needed so much time to study, or why why during those 3-4 hour long pre-clerkships exams I couldn't stand up to go to the bathroom because I was so scared that I would lose time on my exam, but other people weren't worried about that aspect. So there's a lot of little things that when you're constantly comparing yourself to your classmates, it's painful because then you start to question yourself if you're good enough yourself or if you should be where you're at. And the answer is yes. If you're in medical school, you got here for a reason, and you all deserve to be here.
Thank you guys so much for those responses. The second question that I had, and just sharing about, kind of the challenges in pre-clerkship, transitioning into med school, learning where the accommodations offices might be at your institution, or just even learning that is a resource that you can utilize for standardized exams. One of the questions I think comes off just because it was brought up. Can you provide any insights into gaining accommodations for standardized testing in medical school, whether it be pre-clerkship exams, clerkship exams? This is also being featured or being put on by the National MAPS Committee. So we do have a couple pre-med students. So if anyone had experience with getting accommodations for the MCAT, if you can kind of talk about that timeline, that process, that would be great.
I could actually talk about this. So I had accommodations for the MCAT, and I think it was called the Casper. And I would say for it, first of all, it takes a lot of time. So for Casper, for example, you have to make sure you apply for the your date. I think ahead of a certain number of weeks, but you also have to make sure before you know that you have to submit this document, and that has to be approved before you can get this accommodation considered for the day in which you have been assigned. So, I would say it was very challenging in terms of having an organization, sometimes simply because of the extent of documentation that is sometimes required. And for myself, who is very physically different, sometimes it was a little confusing as to the extent in which there needs to be a description of I don't have a hand, please give me the simple needs. So I think despite it being challenging, I think you have to be proactive and think, okay, I know I have to get this documentation at a time. I need to make sure I schedule it with my doctors to make sure that I have like something that lists out this is what I potentially might have, this is what we're considering. At least for myself, it would be I have, this is my disability, these is the things that would be needed on the exam, extra time, extra da da da. And I think the exam, especially the MCAT, were very good at accommodating my needs. I had a scribe who was inside of the room with me, and there was like a dual screen, so we individually had like a monitor, and if I needed somebody to like write for me, so they would just use the mouse and click for me. So that was, very excellent in terms of like what that was being provided. But simultaneously, I would say in terms of accommodations, a lot of times accommodations are not things that you practice with yourself when you practice taking prep exams. So it's kind of like you're experiencing it the first time at the exam site, for example, and that sometimes might affect, how you think about the approach to the exam. So I would say that that should also be a consideration. And in terms of like, the shelf exam, etc., like getting accommodations, again, being very proactive with reaching out to my disability office at Harvard and saying, hey, I would need extra time for this, I'd need da 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 da. And it's been, fine in terms of like being proactive. So thinking ahead for yourself, if you can, especially if you already have a diagnosis, is helpful. But again, if, for example, you don't know what's going on, or maybe there's also time processes between different offices wanting to get back different documentation, and it takes doctors however long sometimes. So I think there's also consideration for that entire process. So I guess being patient and recognizing that, like, at least for myself, sometimes when you think about medicine, it was not necessarily designed to accommodate every single body as what is now being, added to the space now. And I would say when a space is not designed for you, you start to realize when when you start experiencing it. But recognizing, at least for myself, that like it is possible, and connecting with the people and the supports would be possible to making sure that they're successful.
Perfect. Thanks so much for answering that question. Just to clarify, because I had a message come in the private chat, but do you know how much time-wise, as far as months in advance, would you recommend applying for that for the pre-med students? And then if any of the other med students want to jump in afterwards in regards to that, you can.
Yeah, so for me, I can't even remember when I took the MCAT, so I really couldn't say exactly. I would say go directly on their website, on the Casper, on the MCAT website. There's a section for accommodations, and you need to make sure you email them ahead of time and like describe whatever you need and ask them, what do you need and what's the time frame. I would say the sooner rather than later, you should just, seek out that information. A lot of times it's online and available, but a lot of times you have to email the accommodations office to make sure you get that specific documentation. So I don't want to misquote and say, this amount of time before. I know, for example, for Casper, it was at least a month and a half or something like that. But I took the pandemic, so I would look online.
I know for step 1 and step 2, it's a 60-day turnaround at the minimum. And that's what, once you submit the accommodations, they tell you will hear back at the minimum 60 days. Now, sometimes it's sooner, but you have to wait 60 days before you can contact it again to like check in.
Yes, but for the MCAT specifically, I just want to like encourage people to keep pursuing accommodations if they need them. And I want to really encourage you to think about it more as you're really just telling these different systems, whether it's school or the MCAT, how they need to adjust to better support you. And there's nothing wrong with having them adjust because, we all know these systems aren't equitable and it's really just setting yourself up for success. So I know sometimes process for standardized testing accommodation can be expensive. Really find your resources and take the time. I know, like for the MCAT, I just didn't have the energy and I didn't really pursue it, even though I knew it was something I needed, and I regret it because really standardized testing is going to be a part of your career for pretty much the rest of medicine. And like you're gonna want to get this documentation because it's not just for one test, it's really so you know how you can best support yourself. So, like, no matter how difficult it gets, like, the best thing you can do for yourself is to really figure out what do I need to do, what steps do I need to take to put myself in the best position to succeed and just keep pushing for those accommodations.
Perfect. Thank you guys so much for your responses. The next question I have, how do you approach self-disclosure to classmates about your disability or chronic illness, as well as possibly teachers or other attendings or preceptors?
I can answer this. From my perspective, I found that it's best not to disclose if it's unnecessary. So, um, and I forgot to mention in the beginning, I apologize. I'm an M1 at Rush. And so I actually found that there was a couple situations where I wanted to disclose, but I decided not to, and I'm grateful I didn't. Just because not everyone needs to know your business. That being said, I did disclose to my accommodations office, and for everyone else, I highly recommend doing that, obviously, to get the help that you need, but it's not necessary for you to disclose to anyone else. So I found for me it was best not to.
Thank you so much for sharing, Dahlia. And I know it's very difficult, like navigating self-disclosure. That's something that I'm also navigating at times as well. So I think the advice, there were some people who were saying they were having audio issues, but just to reiterate, just kind of using your judgment, essentially, depending on the person, if it's necessary or not necessary for them to know, I think was really great advice that you provided.
So I think I bring in an interesting perspective to this question because I ended up disclosing to a lot and I'm going to say I went public. I went on social media and disclosed it. And I was having a conversation with someone earlier today about it. And I think one of the biggest reasons I was so quick and had so much ease of disclosing is because my intersectionality of living as a Latina throughout my undergraduate pre-medical school career, I had hidden that intersection. I had hidden that identity. And so the second I felt accepted and I felt empowered, to say I was Latina, to see it as a benefit that I could speak Spanish with patients. I started also seeing my health condition as something that could be positive for my classmates and also my future patients. And I didn't go out first thing and did social media. I started small. I started with a couple friends. And then I actually disclosed in one of the virtual settings like this in one of our classes. We were actively learning about the health condition I had, and I told the instructor, I just like messaged her because this was online Zoom class, and I was like, hey, I have something to say. I have an experience. Can I share it at the end of class? And I was super nervous because I didn't even think she would say yes, but she did. And she left 5-10 minutes at the end of class. And I just shared my story and shared my perspective with the rest of my class. And I received such positive feedback that I ended up being like, well, if I just told 20 of my 144 classmates, why not I just tell the rest of my classmates? So then I went on GroupMe and shared it to the rest of the 144. And then it just kept getting bigger and bigger and bigger because I wanted to be in charge of telling the story. I didn't want other people to make their own story or make their own assumptions. I wanted to be the narrator of my own story. And with that concept, I ended up creating a social media, creating a website, and then just it kept getting bigger and bigger and bigger with always the concept of I am advocating not just for myself, but I'm also advocating for other individuals in the medical college and in the medical profession, that we don't have to be just medical students or just doctors. We can be humans too. And so I think that has been kind of my passion, additional passion that I've brought into medicine, that's even brought it so far to actually even disclose my residency applications. So that was my long-winded answer. That I'll leave it for other people to answer, but I wanted to share those little tidbits.
Yeah, I'm in kind of an interesting situation where, again, like a lot of my diagnoses are still being evaluated even now. So I'm on rotations right now, my first set of rotations, and I knew that I was going to need space to um, get these, like my medical appointments, but also with like, for example, some of my symptoms, like the hypersomnia or like the hand pain. I knew that it was going to be really important for some of the teams that I'm with to know, just so like, because patient safety is always my number one priority. And so if I need to take a break to all like make sure like patients are in the best position, like I just needed to ensure that was well communicated. And so I got really good advice from like my administration here at the school. So like I had good relationships with the deans, and I just was very open with them because I had to go back and forth on, do I take a leave of absence or do I continue with rotations? And made the decision to continue with rotations because I felt pretty supported, but I had to let teams know. And I've so far gotten a lot of flexibility to go to medical appointments so that I can take care of these things. And really, it's like hasn't impacted too much clinical experience other than people have been really nice about letting me take the breaks that I need to. And it's not like too often, they're very short breaks, very important breaks, especially in the OR. And so that's been pretty nice. And so again, you kind of have to gauge the team you're with and a trust component, but I'd say it's better to be proactive and to kind of, if you trust the people you're with, say as comfortable as you're sharing what's going on or what you need. And then rather than waiting for something to happen and then you're trying to like explain yourself. So I kind of took a proactive approach because I feel really supported here.
Uh, I will say my experience is probably very different only because when I show up, I have a visible difference. So for me, my disclosure experience is like just existing. And I would say, in terms of getting like needs met or like support in terms of like the clinic, I would say I've been very proactive in terms of saying like, hi, I before I go to teams, like I have one hand. I know that I can do da da da. I know I'm capable of adapting. I've been able to do this, but clearly I need support in being able to do whatever we're going to have to do together or whatever team we're assigned. And also, I think sometimes the challenge is because I live in a very two-handed world with medicine, and a lot of times there is I guess there's not a because the experience is not universal. I think the adaption is like a give and take by multiple parties, and sometimes it's difficult in terms of like how do we approach this in the clinic, how do we approach like doing different things. And I think being very, I guess, open in terms of struggling and realizing that a lot of this is going to be my responsibility going forward because people either do not know or they are not able to help in this space. And that has been I guess a I don't know if you call it a hardship, but more like a thing that I think I've faced since like this, experiencing my disclosure, which is just existing. So for me, I guess, whenever you're the first in of anything, I guess there's always going to be the challenge that you face. But I think knowing a challenge and experiencing it sometimes is very difficult, different. And I would say that, like people mentioned on here, sometimes just like being very proactive and like saying that these are the things I might need are very good in terms of like helping people prepare so that when we show up in the day, there's not thought like, well, I have two hands, so I really couldn't think about that. Like, so I think it's really helpful, at least for myself in the situation of where I am. But I think it also requires a lot of like you're describing, places where you have support and a real like commitment to wanting to think about how do you like work through this. And I think that's like the way moving forward, I guess, in terms of medical education here, for at least from my perspective as a person with a visible disability.
Yeah, thank you guys so much for the responses. I was also just, reinforce that like that's what like makes this panel, like the selection of panelists like so amazing to me is just like the diversity that all of you guys bring in terms of your experience. And just going back to the title of like demystifying disabilities, because sometimes people just have a laser vision of what they're thinking about. And there can be situations where people don't have diagnosis or they have visible disabilities, so they're confronting that, on a daily basis. And then there's some who have hidden disabilities who, depending on how the stereotype or perceptions that maybe your peers, patients, or even, faculty that you might encounter have, it changes the environment that you're dealing with. But I want to move into another question, just looking at if you can kind of just share any like specific resources or support networks that you found during med school that has been helpful to your journey.
I would say
Um,
the
oh,
disability office resource center at my school has been phenomenal because, you know, I needed to get accommodation. I mentioned this several times, sorry, but without a diagnosis. And so really, I just reached out to them anyways. And I'm like, here's the situation. Like, I'm really struggling. Like, this is kind of what I live with every day. And they were able to get me some assistance. So they were able to just tell me, like, if you have somebody who knows your care really well and can still just write an accommodation letter for what you need and why without a diagnosis, like, that's how I was able to get accommodation. I didn't have a diagnosis, but they were able to confirm, like some of the symptoms that I was living with and why I needed the things that I was being asked for. And then actually, surprisingly, the deans at my school have been a phenomenal resource because I didn't even know enough to know what I needed to ask for. So they would just tell me, like, make sure if this is like, here's some things to think about. If you need these additional things, like, you need to let like the Disability Resource Center know to include that in your accommodations. And they just helped kind of get me to better advocate for myself.
So, again, I know I'm having audio issues for some people, so I apologize. But for me, my biggest supporters I found was my accommodations office was really helpful for finding the help that I need, especially when being diagnosed with my things in medical school and not knowing that I had them prior. As well as I'm Latina as well, so the LMSA and the SNMA group in my school was really helpful, and I definitely felt more supported and really helped combat my imposter syndrome. And I think the biggest support for me were actually upperclassmen. I thought I was the only one going through everything that I was, and there's a lot of upperclassmen that have similar things that were able to guide me better through the journey and figuring out what resources I had access to and what resources I didn't know I could use and benefit me.
I would say also, outside of the accommodations in offices in school, there is podcasts and places like Docs with Disabilities that I think has been extremely helpful for me, at least just because I I don't know. I think the experience sometimes feels isolating because, from my perspective, as the only person that I know of in my own class with a visible difference, I think it's good for me whenever I get to hear the perspective of other people, like what they struggle with in terms of like their disability experience in medicine and how they've succeeded, how they've been able to find networks of support and community, in spite of whatever circumstance they're having. And I think for at least that aspect of my identity that has helped and reassured me that, like, okay, people have done it, we will do it, the door will be open, they will do it. It will be okay. So
Yes, very much so. I think it's so important to when you there are so many support groups out there, and I think it's important to just learn about them. We mentioned the Docs with Disabilities. There's also the medical students with disability and chronic illness, and then there's also disability mentors, and there's a couple other ones. But I think that it's so important to reach out to other individuals, reach out to your disability office because they should be connected. Oh, what podcast have you listened to? I'll share. So I started creating. That's what I started doing. Is I feel like there are so many resources out there, and so personally, what I ended up doing is I created a website to kind of house a lot of the resources as I myself use because there's just so much out there. So I'll put that in the comment section of the books because there's a lot of current physicians that have started writing their own books on their experiences, podcasts on. So there's a lot out there, but it's once you get into one of the groups, you'll start learning about all of them. But I'll make sure to put it in the chat.
somebody else also asked about podcasts. I'll also put it in the chat.
Perfect. Thank you guys so much for sharing those resources. Kind of maybe a more challenging question, but can you share any experiences where you felt understood, under supported or misunderstood by faculty or peers, and how did you specifically overcome those challenges?
I won't be specific, but I'll say that when challenges have arisen, and they do arise, it's important to bring in your advocates. And so I learned pretty early on in my medical career that it's important to find the people that are going to support you no matter what happens, whether if that is an attending, a teacher, the disability individual, a counselor. Like, find and keep those mentors close, because there will be points that it's difficult and you need their support. And so it's important to have those emails, have those phone numbers. And it's okay if it takes time. It definitely does take time to find them, but if you keep them close to you and keep updating them when the time comes, and if it comes that you do need support, you can reach out to them, and I'm sure they'll be there to support you.
I also won't be specific, but what I found for me, I wholeheartedly agree with Stephanie. For me, my advocates, I found them in the DEI department, and I'm extremely grateful for them. One thing I did learn how to do too is be an advocate for myself, and that came from a lot of my classmates. And I'm also grateful for them, but also the mentors that I've had to help guide me through everything. And I do just want to add a little tidbit that, don't be afraid to ask for what you need. And if you get pushback, there's always a way to get the support that you need, especially if you're feeling unsupported. It might not be the classic revenues that you're like in the ways that you're told to do so. There's usually a background way, or unfortunately, if it's like something that is not established at your school, asking everyone and their mother to figure out a way how that can be something made accessible for you or for other students. I do think that that's something that I have learned and I have gotten better at doing. So really, like, asking for what I need, making sure that's followed through from my school, and I've had better responses after being persistent and finding my advocates who have helped support whatever things I needed.
Perfect. Thank you guys so much for answering that question. Dolly, you brought up a really good point about advocacy, and that is another question that I have before we get down to our final minutes of this session. But can you guys share any strategies or just your journey towards advocating for yourselves, whether it be in the classroom, clinical settings, and then also, maybe during rotations, and most notably for you, Stephanie, maybe even residency interviews. I would love to hear a little bit about how your advocacy journey from each panelist, if possible.
I would say my advocacy journey, I guess I'm always advocating on behalf of myself. I mean, at the end of the day, from the perspective, from my journey just in life, not just as a medical student, like, you have to speak up, because closed mouths don't get fed, tragically, in this, doggy world sometimes. And I think that if you're not, if sometimes if you're lagging on advocating on yourself, then the opportunity is like lost, and people just, either don't recognize that you need assistance, or perhaps there are other perspectives. So I think for myself, advocacy comes as, making sure I send emails proactively to like groups that I'm about to join. And like I said before, like, this is what I have, this is what I what I can bring to the team. This is how I think at accommodations that I think may be helpful, things like whatever it might be, and going forward like that. And then thinking about if we have any further discussions during the time that we're working together, of course leave it open in terms of flexibility, because at the end of the day, sometimes like you can have rigid types of accommodations set out on paper, but when you apply it directly into like the clinical setting, or so wherever it's supposed to be applied, it doesn't work as best. And I think also learning, like the I think Dahlia, it was the other mechanism, just because the one in front of you for advocacy doesn't necessarily work. There's other spaces that you can also access. And I think also being able to like recognize that like advocating sometimes means saying I need help and seeking that help from somebody else, and how does that help then translate into like connecting to somebody else who can better advocate for your behalf.
Yeah, I agree with like when you said like those mouths don't get fed. I just used to be so quiet and shy and scared of everybody and everything. And so I just would try to push through and not really say anything. And then I find myself in situations where it's like I'm having to explain myself after the fact. And then I just feel like I'm trying to overcome what people's impression, like, and misjudgments of me are. And it just didn't feel very good. And I know, like, sometimes you'll advocate for yourself and, not everybody's going to be open to hearing. But what I've learned in the process is no matter what, you end up finding the spaces where you can flourish, because like who's going to support you, and like you tend to spend more time in those spaces. And so like for me, I'm a very non-trad student, and so it was like finding out very quickly I wasn't in a healthy workplace, and so pivoting to a different job, and then being in an incredibly supportive environment that basically like allowed me to get to where I was today with everything that I was going through. And so that gave me a lot of courage and strength to keep advocating for myself, because the more proactive I became, the more people were willing to like support me. And I will say another component of advocacy is it's not always just going in and saying what you need, but it's really just building good relationships with your administration in general, so that it's like there comes a time when you do need a little extra support, they already know you, they know your character, they know who you are. And that goes a lot better than like kind of trying to explain away things like way after. If that's kind of the situation you're in because you didn't know, just know you can still, like, that's still fine. You can still recover from that. But sometimes it's just having really good connections with the people in your school, so that when you do find yourself needing a little more support, you know who to go to, and like they already know you well.
I know for me, because I didn't know what my issues were until I started medical school, so not having a name to be able to ask for what I needed at the time was hard. But what I found is once I was able to figure out my diagnoses, get the accommodations that I needed, if I ever found myself in a situation, and again, I'm only in my first year, so I can only speak on clerkship, but if I ever found myself in a situation where I felt the need to share something I didn't want to share, I did just loop in my accommodations office and let them speak for me, and would tell like the person or whoever I was talking to, like, the administrative person. I have all my paperwork filed at the accommodations office. If you have any questions, please talk to them. But at this moment, I don't feel comfortable disclosing or things like that. And then also making sure anytime I spoke with an admin, making sure, and especially via Zoom call, like following up with a summary email. This was helpful not only for myself in keeping track of what we talked about and making sure I kept track of what was like advice to me or what I said would be my plan moving forward or anything like that. It also made it so that way the accommodations office, I would also CC them in those emails, so that way everyone was in the loop of what was going on with me in case something in the future happens or is related to what I need. So yeah, making sure you keep a record of everything, and yeah, and if you need to, bring in your advocate, whatever person that you need to stand up for you. Especially sometimes it can be deeply taxing to have to explain yourself, or especially if you're in the thick of things, sometimes it can be difficult to be that advocate for yourself. So it's always okay to ask for an advocate to be there with you, someone that you trust.
Perfect. And then I saw there was a question that came in the chat that I think, Stephanie, you would be great to answer. And also, I don't think I gave you the opportunity to answer about your advocacy journey, but you've definitely shared a lot about that. So I just wanted to highlight that question from Trina. I hope I'm pronouncing correctly, but she just wanted to know if there was any advice for discussing academic irregularities on residency application or interviews.
Yes, I'm so glad you asked this question because it's a very good question, and I like talking about it. And I don't think my 30 seconds is enough justice to this question. But the big thing is there are multiple locations where you can speak on the academic irregularities in the ERAS application. There, if it's like a leave of absence, there's a box that you have like a 2 sentences you can write out there. You can specifically address it in your personal statement. You can address it and there's an additional box that just explains how you've had a unique or diverse experience in your lifetime. You can disclose or talk about it there. And then there's also not talking about it and then waiting till the interviews and waiting till they actually ask you in person. And what always helped me is knowing that if I've got into this interview, that means that my academics are good enough for them, and all they care about is they want to get to know me as an individual. Now, that doesn't mean that they won't ask me. They still ask me about my step 1 fail, or step 1 fails because I failed twice. But the thing is I had a prepared statement of what to say, what I learned from it, and how I was able to succeed. And for me, I succeeded in step 2. So it shows that like I learned from it. I got accommodations. I addressed certain things, and then I showed improvement. If I hadn't showed improvement, I can also say, look, I did really well in my clerkships because I am really good at speaking with patients. I'm really good at presenting, anything like that. But yes, I could talk about this a lot. I don't like constantly do this, but I created a podcast episode all about this. I said discussing the red flags in my residency application because it is a challenge that comes up for a lot of individuals, and I feel like we should talk about it more of how we can address them and also still be proud of our achievements and why we got or how we got to the place that we are today.
Thank you so much for answering that. And now we're getting close to the end. I just have one last question for you guys. Just looking back at, maybe before, because we have callers who are pre-meds and also callers are our audience members who are also in medical school. But looking back, what do you wish that you had known before you started med school or before you started clerkships? Stephanie, most notably, like before maybe even applying to residency, like what is the big advice or one piece of advice that you really want the audience to take from you tonight?
I know for me, finding out about a diagnosis after starting medical school, and also being first gen in medicine, first gen college graduate, being Latina, I came in with medical school with a lot of imposter syndrome, especially moving from the middle of nowhere to a big city. It was major. And so one thing I do want to say is med school is scary, but we need people like you. So whether you also have a disability, whether it's, you're also a person in your family, whether there's some sort of struggle that makes you different, we need diversity in medicine now more than ever. So don't let that be the that stops you from pursuing what you need to. And even if you run into barriers, I mean, all of us on the panel have run into something that has made us doubt ourselves or made us doubt our journeys or anything, but just know that we need you. And so I wish I would have had a little bit more confidence coming into this and realizing that I'm the commodity, that I am needed in medicine, and I shouldn't doubt myself because I was accepted. I'm here. I worked hard. So don't let anyone else tell you different.
I would second that and say, I guess for me, it's like what I wish I knew, or what I wish I've been doing the entire time, is remembering to affirm my position and my space and my deserving to be here, and me, I guess that's what I'm offering as my advice moving forward, is that, again, like, being, again, from, similarly to Dahlia, like, very marginalized identity, and being, from the Caribbean, and Black, and a woman, and disability, like, in theory, the odds are stacked against me, but I would say these are my identities that I hold and I cherish, and I believe that these are my golden tickets in terms of, like, my success. These are the identities that have helped me to, like, shape who I've been, in terms of, like, my resilience, my ability to be an advocate for myself and for other people, my ability to be able to, like, think outside of the box, and, like, think of, like, adaptations in terms of, my regular life. And I think that, like, you need to remind yourself every single time, whenever you feel uncomfortable, because the space does not feel like it was designed to accommodate you, that you deserve to be here, and that even though there are not people around you that look like you, it's okay. You'll open that door, and you'll walk through the door, and you'll leave the door open behind for other people to walk behind you. So I guess for me, I'll just take up space. That's it.
Yeah, I think for me, it was really giving myself permission to take breaks when I need them. I think that there was a lot, I gave myself so much unnecessary pressure to keep, like, portraying this high functioning person, because I was worried about people questioning my ability to make it in medicine, and, like, that I should have never even put that thought in my head, because I know I can make it in medicine, and it's okay to take care of yourself. And so I really just had to let that go. And, like, if there's a day that I'm in so much pain that I can't move, it is like that I'm going to stay home. I'm sending an email. I'll submit my excused absence form when I can, but I cannot make it today. And taking the breaks that I need, and really that's okay. And I still am performing where I need to. And so I think I held myself at too high of a standard, similarly to everybody else, because of, like, imposter syndrome, being first gen, um, just many other reasons. And I, like, as soon as I freed myself of that, and, like, my number one priority at all times is my wellness. I will not let anything get in the way of my well-being, not even medicine. Medicine is a job. My well-being is my life. And so, once that became my priority, like, it really just made a night and day difference for me.
I love what everyone said. They're all so meaningful, and I agree with all of them. I think one of the biggest things I wish to impart on individuals is you are not alone. I think throughout this journey of medicine, we're frequently placed in these different positions, whether if it's because we're spending 30 hours studying a day in the 24-hour day. Yes, I know. Um, but it's just very isolating. And it's important to know that you're not alone in this struggle. Even and especially individuals with disabilities or with marginalized identities, we feel like we're alone, but we're not. And I think that's why it's so important to do what you all are doing right now. You're listening to other people's stories. You are trying to get in a community. Those are all great strategies to combat feeling alone. So don't give up. These 4 other medical students have been able to do it, and so can you. So keep up the good work, and I can't wait to see all of you as future doctors.
Thank you guys so much for sharing that information with us. It's just really incredible just to hear about your stories and your journeys and just the things that you've accomplished, and just knowing that you guys are like rock stars already. And Stephanie, you're like 2 weeks away from finding out where you're going to be going. So I'm very excited for you. But yeah, now that we have reached the end of our session, I just want to extend gratitude to you all again from the National MAPS Committee, for our panelists, for generously, sharing your advice, being vulnerable with our live audience tonight. It is truly empowering and motivational to hear about your success, and how you've made it through your journey thus far to medicine, and just to imagine where you'll be, and getting all of the advice about the resources that students who are going through medical school or applying to medical school soon, that might be able to relate to your identity or some of the struggles that you shared tonight. I want to thank you again for assisting in this advocacy and the cultural change in medicine. Again, the aim of Demystifying Disabilities in Medicine is the title of this series, and really just trying to open up the volume of conversation around this topic, and sharing resources with people so that hopefully there are others who will get earlier diagnosis or assistance from their institutions, if they relate similarly. For those of you who have signed on, please stay tuned for the additional webinars. As I mentioned, this series is one of many series that will be going out throughout the year to support pre-medical students, MAPS and SNMA MAPS, or SNMA medical student members. And then if you want additional updates, please stay following us on IG, Facebook, as well as our YouTube account. A recording of this session will be posted at a later date, for those who weren't able to attend. But thank you all for signing on, and wishing you the best of success in your journey.